Sarah was having a particularly heavy night. The kind of night where loneliness not only kept her company, but pressed down on her chest like an invisible weight. Since breaking up with her boyfriend of 2 years, she had been trying to fill the empty spaces with routine distractions. A new book, a random series, solitary walks around the neighborhood. But nothing seemed to work. It was as if every corner of their house murmured his name. Every object was a ghostly relic of what they had experienced together. That night, on a desperate impulse, Sarah decided to do something outside her comfort zone. Go out alone. She chose a bar she vaguely knew, an out-of-the-way place, far from the places they used to frequent together. It was known as one of those bars forgotten by time, where the music was discreet, the tables were worn, and the regulars were as strange as they were mysterious. When she parked the car in the small lot in front of the bar, the discomfort began to set in. There were no other cars, except a beat-up old Lincoln with its low beams on, casting long, crooked shadows on the cracked asphalt. The vehicle seemed out of place in time, with rust marks covering the bodywork and a metallic smell that she swears she smelled even from inside her own car. Glancing inside the Lincoln, she saw no one. Still, the presence of the car was unsettling. The entrance to the bar was dimly lit, with a neon sign that flashed irregularly. Every time the lights failed, the surroundings seemed to plunge into absolute emptiness. Sarah hesitated. Something inside her screamed to get back in the car, to leave, but the need to feel normal, to escape her own mind, pushed her forward. As soon as she entered, she was greeted by a strange, almost suffocating stillness. The bar was much quieter than she expected. There was an old-fashioned radio on the counter that played a soft melody, but the sound seemed to come from far away, as if it were being played in an endless hallway. The room had a peculiar odor, something between musty and burnt, which made his nostrils burn slightly. The few customers that were there seemed more like part of the decor than real people. An elderly couple sat in the corner, completely still, staring at the wall with glassy eyes. They didn't speak. They didn't move. It was as if they were statues. The bartender, a tall, thin man with a blank expression, cleaned the same glass over and over again, as if stuck in an automatic cycle. Sarah tried to ignore her growing discomfort and headed toward the counter. When she ordered a drink, the bartender looked up for the first time, but his gaze was strange, as if he wasn't really focused on her. He didn't say a word, just handed over the drink and went back to cleaning the glass. She took a deep breath, trying to rationalize. Maybe it was just a strange place, with strange people. Nothing else. Still, her skin tingled, and a feeling of being watched followed her as she walked to the pool table in the corner of the bar. It was then that he noticed something that made his heart race. In the mirror above the counter, she saw the reflection of the elderly couple. They were still sitting, but their faces were looking directly at her. In the reflection, his eyes were not eyes. They were black spots, empty pits that seemed to absorb the light around them. Sarah turned sharply to look directly at them, but as she did so, she found them in the same position as before, facing the wall as before. His hands began to shake, and the glass almost fell from his fingers. Something was very, very wrong with this place, but she didn't want to seem paranoid. I didn't want to give fear control. So instead of running away, she did her best to look natural, walking over to the pool table and starting to prepare a shot for herself. That's when he heard the voice, cold, hoarse, and too close. "Looks like you're alone today." Sarah quickly turned around and found a man beside her. He wasn't there a second ago. He was wearing an old, threadbare coat with stains that looked like oil or dried blood. His smile was unsettling, showing misaligned yellowed teeth. "Do you want company for a game?" he asked while his calloused hands held a pool cue. Sarah's intuition screamed to refuse, to make up an excuse, but the words didn't come. She just nodded, unable to ignore the cold discomfort running down her spine. She didn't know that by accepting, she had crossed an invisible threshold, and getting out of that bar alive would be much more difficult than getting in. Sarah tried to concentrate on the game, but every movement seemed to amplify the strangeness of the place. The man, who had not yet introduced himself, laughed in a low, drawn-out manner as he arranged the balls on the table. The sound seemed to echo in an impossible way, as if the bar were much bigger and emptier than it really was. She noticed something curious. The bar was absurdly quiet. Even the emptiest bars have sounds: the clinking of glasses, muffled laughter, footsteps on the floor. But there was nothing there. The radio was still playing, but the music seemed to be swallowed up by the dense atmosphere, as if the place was alive and the music was unwanted. As they played, the man began to speak. His voice was low and husky, but each word seemed to dig into Sarah's mind like fingernails on a chalkboard. "This bar is special, you know. It attracts people, like you, lost, lonely." He looked at her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Looking for something they shouldn't. Sarah felt a chill. Trying to divert the focus, he forced a smile and asked, "And you, why are you here?" He stopped, leaning over the table to line up the cue. "I'm always here." There was something deeply disturbing about this response. Before she could ask what he meant, Sarah noticed something else unsettling. In the corner of his eye, he saw the elderly couple move for the first time. They were no longer facing the wall. Now they were facing her directly, motionless, with their hands folded on the table. Fear began to seep into Sarah, like ice water rising up her ankles. She looked away, but the feeling that she was being watched didn't go away. It was more than that. It was as if something was lurking inside his own mind, unearthing old fears, repressed emotions. "Everything is fine?" asked the man as he potted a ball with almost supernatural precision. His tone was casual, but there was something in his eyes that made her want to run away. She shook her head, trying to appear calm. "Yes, just distracted." He laughed, a sound that seemed almost mocking. "It's normal. This place does that to people." At that moment, Sarah began to realize that she wasn't just playing pool. The man was studying her, watching every movement, every expression, as if he was waiting for something. She tried to concentrate on the game, but her cue slipped out of her sweaty hand, and the cue ball ended up off the table. Nervous, he tilted his head like a predator watching injured prey. Sarah tried to compose herself. "I didn't want to give him or anyone else in that bar the satisfaction of knowing I was scared." But as the game continued, the discomfort only grew. She noticed that the bartender had stopped cleaning the glass. He was motionless behind the counter, staring at her with the same dead eyes. The other few customers, who had previously been distracted, now also seemed focused on her. Even without moving, there was something in their gaze that seemed wrong. "I think it's my last match," Sarah said, trying to sound casual. The man stopped holding the club mid-swing. He smiled again, but this time it seemed forced, like a mask starting to slip. "Of course, if you think you can get out." The answer made Sarah's stomach drop. She looked around and noticed that the music had stopped completely. Now the only sound was the faint hum of the lights, which began to slowly flicker. "Why wouldn't I leave?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The man leaned over the table, his eyes fixed on hers. "Because no one leaves." At that moment, the bar door opened by itself, as if inviting Sarah to leave. Outside, she could see the old Lincoln parked, its headlights still on, but now flashing like a signal. Sarah knew she was in the middle of something she didn't understand, but it definitely wasn't normal. Fear was no longer just a sensation. It was an overwhelming presence, a force that enveloped her like a cloak. She didn't know what was worse, staying at the bar or risking leaving. Sarah glanced at the open door, the chilly night air entering the bar like a silent warning. But something inside her told her that leaving without thinking could be even worse. She turned to the man, who was still bent over the pool table, watching her with eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. "Come on, Sarah, one last move, just one more." He spoke your name for the first time, and the cold, hollow sound made your heart race. She didn't remember introducing herself. "How do you know my name?" she asked, her voice cracking a little. The man's smile widened, but there was no humor in it. He stood up slowly, tapping the tip of the bat on the wooden floor, the sound reverberating like an endless echo. "I know many things. I know why you are here. I know what you left behind. I know what you fear to find." Sarah took a step back, but noticed something strange. The ground seemed further away than it should have been. He looked around and saw that the bar was different. The walls seemed taller, farther away, as if the place was expanding in all directions. The ceiling was shrouded in shadows that seemed to move, forming patterns that resembled faces. The customers, including the elderly couple, were still motionless, but now their eyes were fixed on her, shining like headlights in a fog. The bartender, previously a passive figure, now seemed to be leaning over the counter, as if waiting for the right moment to advance. "What do you want from me?" Sarah finally shouted, her voice reverberating in the growing emptiness of the bar. The man laughed, but the sound was different this time, deeper, more primal. "It's not what I want, it's what the bar wants." Before Sarah could react, he extended the bat towards her. "Play with me," he said, his voice now filled with an authority that made her shudder. "If you win, maybe the bar will let you go." She knew she shouldn't accept it, but she felt she had no choice. The air around her seemed to close in, as if the bar itself was suffocating her, forcing her to agree. Trembling, she picked up the bat and positioned herself. The man stepped back, watching her like a cat watches a trapped mouse. "Make your move, Sarah." She lined up the white ball with one of the colored ones, but her hands were shaking so much that the shot was weak, almost pathetic. The man laughed quietly and, with one perfect movement, potted 3 balls in a row. "Looks like you're at a disadvantage," he sneered, walking towards her with slow steps. Sarah tried again, but each movement seemed to drain her, as if the bat was draining her energy. The bar around him grew colder, and the shadows on the walls now seemed to draw closer, as if they were alive. "What happens if I lose?" she asked, looking at him. The man leaned in until his face was inches from hers. His eyes were no longer normal. They were black pits, reflecting an infinite void. "You stay, like everyone else." She looked around, noticing something she had previously ignored. The shadows on the walls weren't just abstract shapes. They were people. Faces contorted, mouths open in silent screams, hands outstretched as if asking for help. Every customer in the bar, including the elderly couple, was part of that nightmare, trapped in some kind of eternal torment. Sarah's breathing became labored. Every time she looked at the balls on the table, she felt like she was betting on something much bigger than a simple game. "I won't lose," she whispered to herself, trying to regain her courage. The man just smiled, his figure now looking taller, darker. "We'll see." The game continued, but Sarah knew time was running out. With each mistake, the lights flickered, the shadows drew closer, and the whispers around him grew louder, like invisible voices mocking his attempt to escape. She needed to find a way out, but the question was there really a way out? Sarah knew something much bigger was at stake. Each shot seemed to be a test, an implicit bargain with the dark forces that inhabited that bar. She tried to control her breathing, but fear settled like a weight on her chest, suffocating her ability to think clearly. The man continued to watch her with eyes that seemed to pierce her soul, while the whispers around her grew louder, closer. She looked at the pool table. The balls that had once seemed ordinary were now different, marked with strange symbols, like ancient runes that glowed with a faint reddish hue. The environment around him also changed. The bar felt alive, pulsing, like it was breathing all around you. The walls seemed to tighten, almost as if they wanted to swallow her. The man reached out and ran his finger along the edge of the table, as if savoring the moment. "You know, Sarah, everyone makes the same mistake. They think they have a choice." He took a step toward her, the sound of his boots echoing on the wooden floor, a sound that seemed louder than it should have been. She backed away instinctively, almost tripping over a chair. "What are you talking about? What is that? Who are you?" Her voice was shaky, but she needed answers. He tilted his head, as if debating whether to tell. Then he smiled mischievously. "I'm just a messenger. The real game is not with me, it's with the bar." He gestured around, and for the first time Sarah had the impression that the entire bar was watching her. The shadows on the walls flickered, as if they were living beings. The elderly couple's eyes seemed to shine with a dim light, and even the bartender, standing behind the counter, had a cruel smile on his face. Sarah gripped the pool cue tighter, trying to ignore the cold sweat running down the back of her neck. "Why me?" she shouted, her voice echoing through the bar. The man laughed but did not respond directly. He simply positioned himself for another play and with one perfect movement potted 2 more balls. "Your turn, Sarah," he murmured, giving her room to play. She walked over to the table, but now her legs felt heavy, as if an invisible force was trying to pull her down. He picked up the bat and lined up the next play. His hands were shaking so much he could barely aim. When he finally hit, the white ball slipped to the side, completely missing the target. The man clicked his tongue, disappointed. "It is a shame. I thought you had more determination." Before she could respond, the lights in the bar began to flicker again, but this time they grew dimmer and dimmer until the only light left came from the pool table, casting impossible shadows across the walls. The whispers grew louder, now forming distinct words. "Stay, stay with us, stay forever." Sarah turned around, trying to locate the voices, but there was no one but the man. Still, she felt as if invisible hands were touching her, grabbing her shoulders, her arms, her mind. She screamed, but her voice seemed to be swallowed by the growing emptiness. "The bar likes you, Sarah," the man said, with a smile that now seemed more monstrous than human. "But he hasn't decided what to do with you yet." Suddenly, the elderly couple stood up from their table in the corner, their movements slow and disjointed, as if they were marionettes pulled by invisible strings. They walked towards Sarah, their eyes glowing sinisterly, and their mouths began to open wider and wider, as if they were going to scream. But no sound came out. Sarah backed away, her heart beating wildly. She was trapped. Each path seemed to lead to something worse. The man, now standing next to her, leaned over and whispered in her ear, "The only way out is to win, but remember, no one wins." She needed to think of something, fast. Panic rose within Sarah, pulsing with each quickened beat of her heart. The man's words echoed in his mind like an endless echo. "No one wins." The shadows around her seemed to close in, and the slow, disconcerting movements of the elderly couple were like a countdown to something terrible that she could not yet comprehend. She dropped the pool cue, which clattered to the floor, and took a few steps back. The man leaned casually against the table, watching her with that monstrous smile that seemed to overflow with pleasure at her anguish. "To escape?" he mocked, crossing his arms. "Do you really think you can escape? The bar has already decided that you belong there." But Sarah wasn't willing to wait to find out what that meant. Turning around, she ran towards the bar door. Each step felt more difficult, as if the ground was trying to hold her down. But her adrenaline was pushing her forward. When he reached the door, he opened it with force, hoping to feel the cool night air. Instead, what she found made her stop abruptly. On the other side of the door was not the parking lot where her car was waiting for her. Instead, there was a long hallway lit by flickering lamps that flickered intermittently. The walls were narrow and appeared to be made of rotten wood, giving off a smell of damp and decay. She looked back, expecting to see the familiar interior of the bar, but there was no longer a bar. Now, the man, the elderly couple, and the bartender were there, standing at the entrance to the hallway, looking at her with sinister expressions. "Keep running if you want," the man said, his voice now echoing distortedly. "But each door only takes you deeper." Sarah hesitated. Her body shook uncontrollably, and she felt hot tears streaming down her face. But she knew she couldn't stop. She needed to move. I needed to try something. Running down the hallway, she felt the lamps flickering above her, faster and faster, casting shadows that danced on the walls like hands trying to grab her. The doors along the corridor were all closed, and each one had strange markings, runes that seemed to glow faintly with a red light. She tried to open one, but the handle was too hot to touch, burning her hand the instant she tried to turn it. "It's no use," the man's voice sounded again, but now it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "This place is a trap, and you entered of your own free will." Finally, at the end of the hallway, she saw a different door, a black wooden one with a silver handle that appeared to be intact. Without thinking twice, she ran towards it and turned the handle. The door opened with a bang, revealing the bar, but something was wrong. Now the bar seemed emptier than ever, shrouded in almost total darkness. The elderly couple was again sitting at the table in the corner, but this time their faces were covered by black, deformed hands that came out of the shadows. The bartender was motionless behind the counter, but his head was now tilted at an impossible angle, as if it had been broken. And in the center of the room was the man, now completely transformed. His figure was larger, more grotesque, with eyes that glowed like hot coals, and a presence that seemed to suck all the air from the room. He raised his hand and pointed at Sarah. "Welcome back, Sarah. Ready for the last move?" She felt the tears flow, but there was no time to give in to despair. Without hesitation, he ran back to the door he had entered through. But now, the door was gone. In its place, there was just a wall, covered in the same runes she had seen in the hallway. The lights started flashing again, faster and faster. The sound of whispers grew louder, turning into distant screams that seemed to come from everywhere. Sarah was trapped, and the bar felt alive, vibrating, almost laughing at her panic. She fell to her knees on the floor, feeling like the energy was draining from her body. The man approached slowly, each step reverberating like thunder. "There is no escape," he said now with a multiple voice, as if thousands of people were speaking through him. "This is where fear lives. Where will you live? Forever." Sarah felt the walls of the bar close in around her. His mind struggled to understand what was happening, but it was as if reality was shattering, falling into pieces around him. She was about to lose consciousness when suddenly everything went dark. For a moment, she thought she was dead. But then he opened his eyes. I was at home. At first, it seemed like everything had been a nightmare. He was on the living room floor, his face pressed against the carpet. The lights were on, and the clock on the wall said 3:17. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. Everything seemed normal. His couch, his scattered books, even the coffee mug he had left on the table before leaving. For a brief moment, she almost believed she had imagined it all. But something was wrong. The air was cold, colder than it should be, and there was absolute silence, as if the world outside had disappeared. Sarah stood up with difficulty, her body feeling heavy and her legs shaking. She walked to the kitchen to get a glass of water, trying to convince herself that she was safe. But when he turned on the tap, the water came out red. She stepped back, letting the glass fall to the floor. The sound of glass breaking echoed through the house in a way that felt unnatural. It was then that he heard a sound coming from the room, a low noise like the dragging of something heavy across the floor. She froze, every fiber of her body screaming not to look, but the dark curiosity was stronger. Slowly, she turned around and saw a familiar figure, the man from the bar. He was there, standing in the middle of the room with that evil smile on his face. But now he was different, more monstrous. His eyes glowed like hot coals, and his skin looked wrinkled, as if it were drying out. "Did you think you escaped?" he asked, his voice echoing with a reverberation that seemed to come off the walls. "The bar never lets anyone go, Sarah." She ran towards the front door, but when she opened it, she found the same shadowy hallway she had seen earlier at the bar. The rotten wooden walls, the flickering lights, and the whispers returned, louder, more insistent. She closed the door tightly, but the man was still there, now closer. "Why are you running?" he mocked. "Haven't you noticed yet? You brought the bar with you." The ground began to shake, and the shadows in the corner of the room began to move. They writhed, forming human silhouettes with long arms and slender fingers, which slowly reached out towards Sarah. The shadows were alive. She ran upstairs, locking herself in her room. His hands were shaking so much that he almost couldn't turn the key. Once inside, he leaned against the door, trying to catch his breath. He took his cell phone from his pocket and tried to call the police, but the device didn't work. The screen was black, reflecting only his frightened face. It was then that he saw something in the bedroom mirror. It wasn't his reflection. It was that of the elderly couple from the bar, standing behind her, their black eyes shining, their mouths open in a silent scream. She turned around, but the room was empty. "This isn't happening, this isn't happening," she muttered to herself, trying to believe it was just a nightmare. But the whispers were there, louder now, as if they were inside his head. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and when they came back on, the man was in the middle of the room. He was holding something in his hands, the pool cue. "Let's pick up where we left off," he said, as the shadows around him spread, covering the walls of the room. Sarah screamed, but her voice made no sound. The shadows advanced, swallowing everything around them. She felt the absolute cold, the emptiness, as if she were being dragged to a place where time and space did not exist. And then, silence. When he opened his eyes again, he was at the bar. Everything was exactly as before. The radio played its low, distant melody. The elderly couple was in the corner, and the bartender was cleaning his glass. The man stood before her with a triumphant smile. "Welcome back, Sarah," he said. "Now you understand. There was never a way out." Sarah felt the floor give way beneath her feet, as if the bar was closing in around her. The man's words echoed like thunder in his mind. There was never a way out. She was back where it all started. But now it was different. The air was heavier, saturated with a burning smell that made his lungs burn. She looked around, trying to find some logic in this nightmare. The elderly couple in the corner was no longer motionless. They moved erratically, with movements reminiscent of a film shot at low speed, their faces distorted as if they were made of melted wax. The bartender now had a macabre smile plastered on his face, his eyes glowing with the same reddish light that came from the runes on the walls. The man was still there, in the center of the bar, but now his figure seemed larger, as if he were growing, absorbing the darkness around him. He extended his hand, and with a slow gesture, beckoned Sarah to come closer. "The time has come to understand what you really brought to this place," he said, his voice now multiple, carried with the weight of hundreds of other voices. "I didn't bring anything," Sarah screamed, feeling tears run down her face. "I just wanted to get out of the house. I just wanted to forget everything." The man laughed, but the sound was not human. It was a guttural noise that seemed to come from deep within the earth. "Exactly, Sarah. You brought your pain, your fear, your emptiness. This place feeds off that. That's why you're here." The runes on the walls began to glow more brightly, and the bar seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Sarah felt like she was being sucked in by something invisible, a force that was pulling her towards the center of the room. She tried to resist, clinging to one of the tables, but the shadows around her wrapped around her wrists, her ankles like living chains. "The bar isn't just a place," the man continued. "It's a door, a portal to where the pain never ends, where those who enter become part of it." Sarah looked around, trying to find some way out, but everything seemed further and further away. She looked at the elderly couple and for the first time realized who they were. They weren't just strangers. They were his parents, or rather, what was left of them. "No, it can't be," she whispered, the horror in her voice growing. The man nodded slowly. "They also came here once, carrying your own shadows, and just like you, they couldn't leave." The figures of her parents stood up, their bodies distorted and staggering, and began to walk towards Sarah. Their faces were disfigured, but their eyes still had traces of who they were, and it broke her heart. "Please," Sarah begged, now crying desperately. "I don't want to stay here. Let me out." The man leaned over her, his huge, monstrous hands gripping Sarah's face tightly. "The only way out, Sarah, is to accept it. The bar only exists because you allowed it to exist. His pain brought him to life. Your struggle only fuels you." She fought against him, but the shadows held her tightly. The runes began to expand, covering the floor and walls, until all that was left was a vortex of darkness. "You're part of this now," the man said, as he pulled her into the darkness. "Welcome to the bar." Sarah felt her body being swallowed by the shadow, and her mind was invaded by voices, whispers, and screams. She no longer knew where it ended and where the bar began. His body, his soul, everything he was now part of that place. The next morning, the bar was as it always had been. The sign blinked erratically, the radio played a low melody, and an elderly couple sat motionless in the corner. The bartender cleaned the glasses with his blank expression. The door opened and a new figure entered. A man, apparently searching for something or trying to escape himself, looked around. He didn't know he had just entered the place where fear lives, where pain never ends. And in the center of the bar, a new figure stood next to the pool table, with a dark smile and eyes that glowed in the darkness. It was Sarah. The cycle had started again.